So, yesterday we left Gautama, the Buddha to be, having decided to stop the practice of austerities after having his experience of remembering being a child under a rose apple tree and becoming spontaneously meditatively absorbed. He's had the realization that punishing the body is not the path to awakening, and he's taken the courageous step to give up his reputation as a great ascetic. He's risked the scorn and rejection of his fellow practitioners, and he's left on his own to find a secluded place to practice meditation. So he enters even more deeply into the forest, into the jungle, and some say this happens almost immediately after his giving up of asceticism. Some say there's a period of facing his fears in the dark forest before he sits down near the banks of a river under a great peepal tree, later to become known as the bodhi tree. And some say he washes and in the river, and he meets a grass cutter who gives him a bundle of grasses to make a comfortable meditation seat under the tree. And he sits down to meditate, and he vows not to move until he has gained awakening, till he has seen and experienced the path beyond suffering. And as he meditates, he becomes increasingly absorbed, gets into some very supple and subtle states of mind. And as is the way with these things, all hell breaks loose and Mara appears. Mara, the embodiment of death, of limitations, of fixity, of desire. He who is master of the whole realm of samsara, the whole realm of conditioned existence. And Mara attacks Gautama as he sits. He sends a vast army of demons who ride wild elephants, who fling rocks and spears and wield flaming swords. They crash around. At other times, complete darkness descends on Gautama, and he's in the eye of this maelstrom, of this storm of attack. But nothing that Mara does, nothing that Mara's horde of demons throws at Gautama touches him. Everything that becomes near him just simply turns into a flower and gently drops to the ground around him. So all of Mara's attempts to harm and to stop the Buddha to be gaining awakening end in a shower of flowers. So Mara changes tack. He sends his beautiful and voluptuous daughters to tempt Gautama. And it's said they dance provocatively in front of him with hips like swaying palm trees. Some even yawn and sigh suggestively. Some even half unveil their faces. But again, Gautama doesn't react. He continues to meditate, and he sees these beautiful young women going through the aging process and becoming much, much older, and they lose their allure. He continues to meditate, and Mara, growing increasingly frustrated, says that he has the right to sit where Gautama is sitting, this spot of awakening, this spot of enlightenment, sometimes called the Vajrasana, the diamond throne, this spot where traditionally all Buddhas of all times gain awakening. And in fact, it is Mara who should be sitting there, because it's Mara who's at the centre of things. It's the Mara who rules over samsara. And his whole horde vouch for him. All the monsters and demons roar their approval at this. And Mara turns to Gautama and he says, well, they all vouch for me. Who vouches for you? Who says you should be here? What right do you have? And Gautama doesn't say anything. All he does is he just gently touches the earth with his hand, and the earth goddess appears. She comes out of the ground, and she says that she has always been there. The earth witnesses everything, and she's seen Gautama's diligent practice through many, many lifetimes. She's seen his kindness, his wisdom, his compassion, his diligence, his energy, and she vouches that he indeed has the right to sit at the Vajrasana, the place of awakening. And with this, Mara realises that his attempts are futile, and crushed and broken, he slopes away, leaving Gautama to his meditations. Gautama becomes increasingly absorbed. His mind becomes more and more still, more and more subtle and supple, more malleable, more fluid, more transparent, and he sees more and more clearly. And he sees all his past lives, his countless past lives of being, becoming, and passing away. Again and again and again, he sees all his past lives. And he clearly sees how each of his actions have had a consequence, how the past informs the present. And he sees how his actions that are in line with wisdom and compassion help generate a decrease in suffering, and he sees how when he acts from greed, hatred and delusion, how suffering increases. And he sees this with a clarity that he's never experienced before. And this leads him to the very clear realization that all things indeed depend upon conditions, and that nothing is actually fixed of itself. Everything is empty of any fixed and permanent selfhood or nature, and that creates an enormous sense of freedom and possibility. And it's this fixity that is the root of suffering. It's this illusion that things are discrete and they're not dependent upon conditions, that this flow, and in a sense, Gautama enters this stream of fluidity. His mind becomes completely fluid. All vestiges of fixity, permanence, self-reference evaporate. And some say this forms in his mind very clear models of how conditionality works. The Nidana chain, for example, or a realization of the Four Noble Truths, of how suffering arises and the path that leads from suffering, the Noble Eightfold Path. And some say he has a very clear image of his sense of a fixed self being like a house that's constantly being constructed, constantly being added to. And he has an image of that house collapsing, the ridgepole that holds the roof up cracking, and the whole house comes tumbling down. The whole sense of his identity, his fixed self, evaporates and crumbles. And as the morning star rises, he gains full and perfect awakening, and he becomes the Buddha, one who is awake. So that's how far we're going to take the narrative this morning. Yes, it's no small feat trying to sum up the Buddha's awakening. How to do that, how to give that any sort of justice. I'm going to continue with the way of looking at this story. I'm going to look at this experience sort of poetically, from almost treating it like a dream or a fairy story. So I'm not going to go into so much sort of more cognitive, methodological aspect of the Dharma, the Nidana chain, for example, or the Four Noble Truths. I'm going to look at the images and in the story and unpack them more than the concepts and ideas. So first off, it's interesting, we're back to the this recurring motif of time. It's interesting that in some of the accounts, all this happens within a day. He goes from being a man almost starved to death to being miraculously rejuvenated by Sujana's rice milk. In other accounts, there's a longer period of time. So we're in mythic time here. We're outside time. Time is doing the strange things that time does in myths and stories. There's a lovely little detail in one version of this where the rice milk is divided up into 49 parts to last for the next 7 weeks. So he sort of, it's got a nice little image, isn't it? The sort of the Buddha preparing for his expedition and making sure he's well set up. And what we were talking about yesterday, about this theme of self-care, there's this sense of there's an element of self-care, and it's this theme of self-care. He's found this pleasant place to meditate under the shade of a tree next to a river. He's got a source of water, somewhere to bathe. It's got shade. And he meets the grass cutter who gives him the the grasses to make a comfortable seat. So he's set up camp, as it were. He knows what he needs to gain awakening, and he's set up the conditions for that to happen. And I find the meeting of the grass cutter and the gift of the grass is a lovely pairing with Sujana and the rice milk, the receptivity to the gift of another. And I really love the fact that it's a man and a woman, the masculine and the feminine are both coming together and helping create the conditions for the awakening to happen. And we've also got the recurring image of the river and the tree, which in themselves, a tree is solid and grounded and rooted in the earth, and a river is fluid and changing and movable. So you've got stability and fluidity together in the landscape. Again, this coming together of yin and yang, lotus and vajra, sun and moon, whichever metaphors work for you, they come together. And again, there's a ritual bathing in the river before he sits down to meditate. Again, there's the redemptive washing that's been repeated throughout the story. And he takes his place under the tree at what's termed the Vajrasana, the diamond throne, this spot where all Buddhas gain enlightenment. Similarly, we looked at yesterday the way the golden bowls all end up in the same place. There's this pattern in the Buddhist tradition where all Buddhas follow an archetypal pattern themselves. And I think, again, this suggests a stepping out of space and time, that we're in a kind of timeless pattern. There's a timeless truth at work here that's applicable in all circumstances. Not literally, but there's a kind of a ground, as it were, of truth we're beginning to touch. A groundless ground, an empty ground, of course, but there's kind of a ground that we're beginning to touch here. And I find it interesting that it's this diamond throne, the Vajrasana, the Vajra, of course, being the diamond thunderbolt, this very powerful symbol, a symbol of incredible kind of strength and durability. And I do wonder whether what is happening here is a container is being created, a container for the experience of awakening to happen within, like the alchemical vessel that I've mentioned. The alchemists would always say that you need a very strong vessel for the transmutation of lead into gold to happen. You need a strong vessel, because you're going to be dealing with very, very powerful forces. And as we can see, Mara appears, and those very powerful forces are awakened. Another image that you might think of as it's almost like a nuclear reactor. You need those incredible strength of a nuclear reactor to hold the reaction, to hold the transformation. Because also a Vajra is a transformer. It's the Vajra, the point. The transformation of the 5 poisons into the 5 wisdoms. So there's all this imagery of transformation happening, the container of transformation, the place of transformation. This need to be held, this safe spot, this comfortable spot, and you could say the posture itself in meditation. Paramananda quite often talks about this. The posture is the alchemical vessel. The body is where awakening takes place. and the body becomes the alchemical vessel. The posture in meditation becomes the Vajrasana, the place of transformation. And this strong container is really, really important because I think what happens with practice, we don't often talk about this in Triratna, is practice releases energy. Practice, we all know that experience of possibly after a particularly strong ritual in the evening or a meditation that's really gone deep, or we just can't sleep. You've got all that energy, or you come off retreat and you're charging around and you've got all that energy, and often we don't know what to do with that energy and we kind of blow it. Someone once said we're like sailors coming off ship with our wages in our pocket, and we blow it almost immediately. We go and spend all our wages, we spend all our merit, and it's the management of that energy is a huge part of practice. I think it's a huge part of practice. I think one of the great ironies of practice can be that it releases a lot of libido, which then needs to be skillfully managed. That might suggest why many gurus get themselves and others into the trouble that they do. Probably the less said about that, the better. But anyway, practice does release energy, and energy needs to be managed skillfully. That's not to say that energy is bad or wrong. It's how we manage that energy is the important thing. So we've got this strong container, and that strong container allows Gautama to bear his experience, to bear his feelings. It's interesting that he's got the container of meditation, he's got the container of the posture, he's got the container of the environment, and he's at the base of the world tree. You could see the bodhi tree as a expression of the world tree that appears in a lot of mythologies, and I find it very significant. He's at the base of the world tree, and of course there's the branches above and the roots below, and which is almost like a Vajra. It's almost like the Vajra. There's this symmetry, and he's at this. Actually, I've got a Vajra here. So it's almost like the Vajra, and he's at the axial point in the centre. He's at this point of balance, and he's absorbed. And it's very interesting that with his practice of asceticism, he's tried to control his mind. He talked about being like a strong man, subduing a weaker man. He tried to crush his mind, and he realised that doesn't work. So there's a really radical shift that takes place here from trying to control the mind to observing the mind. So he observes the mind. I mean, it's always worth noting it takes a huge amount of discipline to observe the mind. That's really important. But he's not trying to control the mind. He's observing the mind. So there's not this kind of furrowed brow kind of constraint or constriction that I get a sense of with the practice of austerities. So he's observing the mind. And then, as is the way with these things, we've probably all experienced this. One of the great ironies of practice is when we become stiller, more absorbed, when our practice deepens, it's not just a sort of, up and up and up and up and away. Often things emerge in our practice, quite painful feelings, quite painful memories, desires, cravings, ill will. We start to see clearly how our mind works, what goes on in our mind. And Mara is the embodiment of that. Mara, the Lord of desire, death, fixedness, limitation, contraction, stuckness, the fixed sense of self. And this is the complete opposite of freedom. It's the complete opposite of freedom. It's this contracting energy, this kind of the clenched fist. You could see Mara as the clenched fist, which is terrified of opening. It's a little bit like, I sometimes think of it a little bit, like when your leg's gone to sleep or something, and it's actually more painful when the life comes back to it. The irony being you have to get that difficult phase where the life comes back. So from Mara's point of view, this is apocalyptic. From the ego's point of view, practice is utterly apocalyptic. It's the end of our world from that limited sense. It's like we've been huddled in a little cave or a shack, and we're just terrified of stepping outside it. We was it the Tibetans say we can even make hell comfortable. So Mara embodies all these forces and does what he can to halt this process, to halt this opening. And he responds as we do, with hatred, greed, and delusion. It makes me think of the first law of thermodynamics. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. We do sometimes kick the hornet's nest with practice, and we need to be prepared for that, and to realise that it's a perfectly kind of healthy and normal part of practice. It's a sign that we're doing things right rather than we're doing things wrong in a way. But obviously, it's finding a way of managing those reactions in a way that's sustainable, that doesn't overwhelm. Because it's a powerful set of images that are presented to us of Mara attacking with these demons and rocks and vats of boiling oil, and I mean there are these incredible graphic descriptions of Mara's attack. It is the full-on Hollywood movie. I'm sure one day there will be a Hollywood movie, and they will have the special effects department will have a field day with the attack of Mara. But isn't it amazing? I mean, on that note, isn't it amazing? You can imagine the Hollywood version. There would be some bare knuckle fight, wouldn't there, between Gautama and Mara, wouldn't there? There'd be some cliff-top battle where, of course, Gautama would win and Mara would be flung to his doom, and Gautama would rise triumphant. And much, I'm sure, to the disappointment of the scriptwriters, he sits there and does nothing. He sits there and does nothing. And you get that beautiful image, don't you, of the everything that's thrown at him turn into flowers. I've sprinkled rose petals around our avatar of Gautama here, sitting under the bodhi tree. And it's a complete state of non-reactivity. I'm sure we've all been in those situations where we felt like someone has been quite deliberately trying to wind us up. And you all know that horrible feeling when you fall for it, when you kind of get sucked into to some sort of perverse psychological game. And if you're anything like me, you think, oh God, I've done it again. Why did I let myself fall for it? Because you end up throwing more kind of fuel on the fire, and you perpetuate a game. I mean, it's almost that image of samsara, the wheel rolling on. We perpetuate something. And it's also interesting that Mara uses complete darkness, complete extinction as well as a tactic. And again, Gautama just sits there, just gently observes what's going on. And then, of course, Mara, when that doesn't work, sends his daughters. Now, of course, with the daughters, it's important to replace the daughters with daughters of all genders and none. Basically, whatever floats your boat, whatever generates craving in you. Maybe it's a parade of ideal homes. Maybe it's food. Maybe it's money. Whatever the source of craving is for you. And again, it's quite a surprise, isn't it, with practice, that we sit down, we go on retreat, or we sit down to meditate, and we kind of maybe have a fantasy that we're going to have these lovely spiritual thoughts and feelings. And of course, while we're all sitting there, Lord only knows what's going on. I sometimes think it would be very interesting. I'm sure probably one day we'll have the technology where there'll be some kind of, terrifying though it is, there'll be some sort of speech bubble above our heads with what's actually going on in the shrine room. My version would probably be X-rated sometimes. So it all goes on basically. And again, we could get very judgmental about that, which is a great tactic of Mara's, just layers on a whole set of judgments, which is quite good at keeping us stuck in our sense of fixed self. But he responds with this experience of seeing impermanence. I mean, one of the characteristics of craving, and as craving gets stronger, it becomes more and more obsessive. Craving, if you really get obsessed with something or someone, your focus really, really narrows down. And by bringing in impermanence, Gautama's kind of widening the picture. I mean, it's a really, you can see why in throughout the Buddhist tradition, the reflections on impermanence, for example, are brought in because they do really help. They're a very good corrective. The reflections on impermanence are a very good corrective to that obsessiveness, that kind of fixity onto something, to realise that things aren't going to last. And it's always worth remembering that the good stuff, as it were, doesn't last, but it's also worth remembering the bad stuff doesn't last as well. When you're really suffering, it's always worth remembering this too shall pass. This too shall pass. So it's worth remembering that. And there's this space around experience. I get this sense of Gautama's mind, his consciousness, his awareness growing and growing, and there's more and more space around his experience. And the bigger the space, the less effect these sort of psychic disturbances have. Be big, not good. Be big, not good. The bigger we are, the less, the bigger our mind is, the bigger our perspective, the less rattled we become, the more kind of stable we become. And of course that doesn't work, so Mara tries something else. Mara's nothing if not resourceful, and we probably all experience this in our own minds. And Mara uses the weapon of doubt. Who do you think you are? Some of us have probably heard that. That's a particular Mara of mine. Who do you think you are? What right does Gautama have to sit at the Vajrasana? And he affirms his right to be centre stage. I rule the show round here. I'm in control. Because it's this relinquishing of control that we find so terrifying. It's there's a phrase I heard recently. I should find out where it comes from, but it says something along the lines of the Buddha controls nothing. Yeah, we can control nothing. We can influence everything. Yeah, I've got all that terribly muddled up, which is the perils of things being recorded. But anyway, but we can't. I was really shocked. I remember many years ago discovering that the Buddha wasn't in control of everything, and being really shocked by this. But then realizing the Buddha is not in control. Awakening doesn't mean we're in control of everything. Awakening means finding a way of being in a world out of control and realizing the positive influence that we can have. Of course, we can have an influence, but we're not in control. And yeah, we all recognize that sense of doubt, that insidious sense of doubt. This scene with Mara always makes me think of those films where you have a particularly kind of cunning and vicious lawyer for the prosecution who's got these really strong arguments and can sort of twist the facts and can really really get in there, find all the weak spots and really exploit them. And similarly, that phrase about the devil having all the best tunes, the most kind of seductive narratives, because it is interesting how convincing these our self-destructive, limiting voices can be. They're so convincing, aren't they? It makes such rational sense to give up practicing, to not meditate, to do something else. It just makes perfect sense, perfect sense. And it can feel the opposite, can't it? To want to practice, to want to go on retreat, to want to do something that helps your practice. It can feel crazy. It can feel so irrational. It's the oh, this is boring. Oh God, I wonder what's on Netflix. Oh, that drawer really needs sorting out. You know those reasons you find not to meditate if you're anything like me. They're so absurd quite often, but they're so convincing in the moment, aren't they? They're so convincing. And then I'll ... whatever. It's so convincing. It's so convincing. And we've got this constant kind of self-talk and self-dialogue that's going on. And there's a real art, I think, to listening to those voices, but not believing them. Well, that's interesting. It's that sort of bit like that Zen master, famously said, "Oh, is that so? Oh, that's interesting." Because the real problem, I think one of the main issues with practice is, unfortunately for a lot of us, we've internalized a lot of voices. We've internalized a lot of self-talk. And it's the really difficult part, I feel, is not, rather than dealing with those negative forces outside of ourselves, which of course is really important, but the real work is dealing with them inside ourselves. Who do you think you are, as one of mine? It's the people who said that to me are kind of not in my life anymore. So I can't really blame them now, in the here and now, for the continuation of that. It's me dealing with those voices in the here and now that is the real work. There's that line, those lines from that Radiohead song. You do it to yourself, just you and no one else. And that's what really hurts. And that's what really hurts. Which I find that last line quite devastating in a way. That if you've ever had that realization of how much the realization of how much suffering we create for ourselves, even with all my kind of anger at other people of what they've done and they should have been different. and they should be different. But really, the generation of suffering that I've done for myself through my lifetime is quite devastating realization in some ways. And that requires a huge amount of kindness, huge amount of softness. And I love this image of the petals falling, the flowers falling around Gautama. And also this lovely, gentle image of just touching the earth. He doesn't argue, he doesn't fight, he doesn't get into a big dialogue, he doesn't come up with some clever answer. You know, if you're like me, you have these kind of arguments in your head and you're, I should have said this, I should have said that, and you can go, and he just completely steps out of the game. He just completely steps out of the game and just quietly touches the earth. That quiet confidence. And the earth goddess appears, this, Mother Nature, receptivity, this the beauty of the world. And I wonder if something's in all this about just trusting ourselves, trusting our own bodies, trusting the world, trusting our practice. Just a real gentle trust that allows, that awakening is here, Tathagata is here, Buddha nature is here. It's nowhere else. It's here, right now, in our experience. The jewel, as I said yesterday, the jewel is in the sewn into the hem of our clothes. And we just don't realise it. And yet Gautama just gently touches the earth and it's there. Sort of knocks on the door almost, and the door opens. Yeah, I wonder, I mean, this might be a controversial thing to say, but it's sort of almost seeing awakening as natural, a sort of natural state. That's, but yet we cover it up, don't we? We cover it up with our greed, hatred, and delusion. We cover it up with our unhelpful responses to life. Gautama has this experience of seeing all his past lives, and the question of rebirth, I know for some people is quite difficult, and you may have issues with that, or you may not. But I think there's a really important image here of knowing ourselves, of knowing our history, of knowing who we are, of where we've come from. Gautama has a very, very clear sense of how he's got to where he's got. Sees it really clearly. You could see that over many lifetimes, or you could see that over one lifetime. The many lifetime model works for me, I have to say. But if it doesn't, just think of it in terms of this lifetime, having a sense of, how did I get here? What led to this me being me in the here and now? Know thyself, as the famous adage goes. And it also, again, is a suggestion of being out of time. Gautama's stepped out of time. Time, as I keep alluding to, is a fascinating topic in the Dharma. And I would suggest that time is not in no way linear or the way we common sensely experience it. And interesting, science is going this way to seeing time as being deeply mysterious. You've only got to look at certain advances in quantum physics to see that time is deeply mysterious, deeply, deeply mysterious. And to what extent is awareness out of time? That's a really interesting little experiment about awareness and time. And when you're really aware, if you really dwell in awareness, what's your experience of time? I suspect this is what Eckhart Tolle is getting at with his whole Power Now kind of teachings. it's very, very mysterious time, and very experienced the relationship of awareness and time. But that's a whole subject, that one. But that experience, I think, of seeing the past lives, you can see how I know when I look at my own life, I can see how things have arisen dependent upon conditions. It's a very clear seeing of conditionality. And this second insight that Gautama is said to have under the Bodhi tree of the truth of karma, of seeing how the past conditions the future, or the present, I should say, and how things arise dependent upon conditions, and they are empty of any fixed sense of unchanging essence. Now, this is one of those teachings which I can say a few sentences, and I once heard conditioned co-production described by a scholar as a banal teaching. Can't say anything more banal than things dependent upon conditions. Of course they are. Makes common sense. But how often do we live our lives not based on that truth? How often do we not live our lives based on a realization of conditionality? It's so obvious on one level, but I think the thing is it's a vastly more profound teaching than that, because if you really dwell on it, it's the route to complete freedom. Because if things are empty of a fixed self nature, then complete freedom is possible. There's the space to move. There's an openness. It's this moving into this sense of expansiveness that we've touched on. It's moving into a sense of expansiveness. And obviously, there's a lot I could say about that, or not, as the case may be, because it's such a, as the Buddha himself later said, it's a profound and subtle teaching, difficult to grasp. It's sort of under our noses and deeply, deeply mysterious at the same time. And of course, Gautama spent the rest of his life trying to work out how to communicate that experience, and used all these different methods. Just as I'm here in the here and now, grasping for words, images, concepts to try and communicate something that I've got in my own small way, I've got an intuitive sense of. You kind of, it's like any of these profound experiences. I'm sure you come off retreat and you try and communicate your experience to someone else. It's a bit like, and you might use a metaphor, and we kind of stumble about trying to find the words, but they're never quite adequate, are they? They're never quite adequate. So all these models evolved from Gautama's experience. And these, in some accounts, these are literally kind of woven into the experience underneath the Bodhi tree. That literally the model of the 12 Nidana chain, for example, or the Four Noble Truths, or the Eightfold Path, all kind of appeared to the Buddha in the moment, and then he communicated. I mean, the scholars seem to be saying that those things actually probably evolved over time. That there was, the suggestion being, there was an incredibly kind of deep, intuitive experience that then, as through the Buddha's teaching career, he evolved methods of communicating his experience. They became more sort of formalized, as it were. But we've got this, it's also communicated, I think, rather beautifully in this image, very, very different to those much more cognitive kind of models. This image of the house builder, this image of the house collapsing, that the ridgepole is shattered. Maybe it's because I've spent so many years repairing buildings that this image resonates with me. I know looking after a building like Rivendell, it feels like this endless task. Just as you repair one bit, another bit starts to rot or fall down or break, and you rush over and you kind of repair that bit, and then another bit goes. I think it's a bit of a sign. I've been at Rivendell for 18 years now, and I'm now going around repairing the repairs, and the repairs that I did. Some of the repairs I did 18 years ago are now rotting and falling apart and part of impermanence. I might say something about my workmanship, but anyway. But it's a very strong teaching on impermanence, actually. It really is. Very, very strong teaching for me personally. But this image of the house collapsing, this sort of almost, again, apocalyptic image of the house collapsing. On my ordination course, I got ordained in Gucaloca in the mountains of Spain, and there's a lot of old rural farm buildings in the area, and often they've just been abandoned quite eerily. There's literally a wine bottle still on the table and a dress. I remember seeing one where there was a dress on a coat hanger on the wall, and just very, very like scenes from a film, and but like the roof would maybe have collapsed in on this sort of domestic scene, and the walls would literally be crumbling and collapsing, and there was some very heavy rains during my ordination course, and I literally kind of watched day by day this building collapse, and it was a very strong image, and it really inhabited my dream state. I would have these very strong dreams about buildings being washed away. Such a strong image of water and stone and impermanence and change. And I think in some ways my psyche was offering up an image of changing selfhood, of self-views collapsing, of the, again, we've got the transformative, redemptive water coming in to wash something away, to change some state of fixity. So that image to me of the house builder seems particularly kind of pertinent. This sense of a fixed self crumbling and disappearing and changing. Again, as we've said, it's important not to it's not to sort of get too fixated on. I think the teachings around no self need very, very careful and sensitive handling, because they can very easily, as I've said previously, slip into nihilism, and getting the balance between knowing yourself and letting yourself go at the same time is one of the great arts of practice, I think, of really knowing ourselves as the Buddha did by this experience of all his past lives, and this letting go of that at the same time. I think it's really, really important. And it's really important that, because it points to the conditionality, really. We see the conditions on which we've arisen. And this, of course, to round up, there's this image of the morning star arising, of awakening. It's interesting, enlightenment is a term that comes much, much, much later. I think it might even be a 19th century translation. The Buddha's one who awakes. The Buddha's woken up. It's an experience of awakening, and that, I think, is another fantastic metaphor that again appears in a lot of stories and fairy tales. We've of course, Sleeping Beauty. This sense of waking up from something, this sense of waking up from a dream, this sense of a real turning about in our consciousness, this radically different way of experiencing this knowing, this gnosis, that's not a cognitive understanding. It's something that's soaked into our very being, into our bones. It's not something we just realise with the top of our heads. This is where it's so important to bring in the heart, to bring in chitta in its fullest sense, heart, mind. That this is something we know in the heart, not just the head. It's not just ideas about things. It's not ideas about how things should be. It's a real deep, deep knowing. So we'll leave the Buddha, as he now is, sitting under the bodhi tree, absorbing his experience, which we'll explore tomorrow. So we'll have a tea break in a moment. But I've put these reflections up on the Padlet, and you always might like to reflect on some of these, one of these, none of these. So what creates the conditions for stability and equanimity in your life? What creates the conditions for stability and equanimity in your life? What's your sitting under the bodhi tree on your grass mat with your carefully divided 49 portions of rice milk? Do you have a sense of the factors that have made your sense of identity, the conditioning of your life experience of family, ancestors, social conditioning? Just a sense of those conditions, those stories you've inherited, those ways of seeing the world, those traditions, those rituals, those laws. And that may give rise to you asking, well, who or what are your own personal Maras? Mara always knows exactly how to communicate with you directly, knows you inside out. And I'll say a bit more of that in a moment. And this is a bit esoteric, but do you have an experience of a fixed, unchanging self? Just ask yourself that question. Are you a fixed, very fundamental? Do you have an experience of a fixed? If so, where is it? What is it? What colour is it? What does it look like? What does it sound like? Where does it live? You can ask yourself that question. And just imagine the last one. Just imagine how it would feel to let go of all the fixed stories and views that define yourself by. How would it be to listen to those stories but not believe them? To have more space around them? And you might like to explore these things by sort of engaging with them a bit more imaginatively, a bit more creatively. You might like to make something, you might like to draw something, you might like to write something, you might like to dance something, you might like to knit something, you might like to sing something. You could create your own Maras. A good friend of mine made a lovely set of Maras of their own, all the things that hold them back. Maras with TV sets for heads, Maras wielding shopping bags. What are those Maras? Are they holding up placards going, who do you think you are? What are your marks? And it can be quite, if you bring in a sense of playfulness with these things, it creates a bit of space around them. Mara hates comedy. Mara hates comedy. Mara hates humour. Those voices love to be taken terribly, terribly seriously. And another interesting way of exploring this stuff is you can create a dialogue between, say, Mara and the Earth Goddess. Some of you might have done this. It could be quite a good way of. I've done it on solitary retreat where you write out a dialogue. You sit with no one around, no one to think you've gone a bit mad, but you can sort of, Mara can be going, "Who do you think you are? Who do you think you are?" "Well, I'm just sitting here meditating. It's quite nice." "Ah, it's rubbish." "Oh, quite enjoying it actually. Should be doing something else." "Oh, what should I be doing?" Something important. Go and change the world, you selfish so and so. "Well, I'm kind of trying to change the world by sitting here." And you can just sort of play with it. It can be quite helpful, quite helpful. And you can really let rip. Actually, it does actually. If there's no one around, you can have a real ding dong, which can be quite therapeutic. And it's interesting how it can evolve into actually a conversation rather than an argument, and those different parts of you can start talking to each other. And this is a bit of an ask, but maybe you can create an image of complete freedom. What would that look like? What would that feel like? What would that be? Collage is quite good for this. You can tear up old magazines and things, make collages. Anyway, there's plenty of food for thought there. So a lot of material. It's big subject.